Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Welcome to Religion and Life. When we think of healthcare, we normally picture hospitals, doctors, and x-rays. But there's also an ancient approach to health and well-being that is sometimes called alternative healthcare. Here to talk with us about some of these practices, such as massage, acupuncture, and medical plants, and the spiritual dimension underlying them is Jacqueline Sharp of Sunlight Massage Therapy in Boone. Welcome, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much.
So when we talk about alternative healthcare, we're really talking about a variety of techniques and approaches to well-being, including some of the modalities that you practice, such as massage, acupuncture and acupressure, use of medicinal herbs, medicinal plants, and so forth. Can you describe for us how this works and goes together to help facilitate health and well-being?
Sure. Okay, so the whole point of all of this is based on Taoist philosophy from way back when. On
Taoist philosophy being an ancient Chinese philosophy.
An ancient Chinese philosophy that is all about recognizing that life is all about change and movement. And when things don't go with that flow, things get stuck or stagnant, and this happens in the body, this can happen in the mind, and our job as healthcare practitioners is to move that energy. So for instance, if you were to come in and I were to treat you, it's like taking a snapshot of the body of all the places where there is stagnation or there's a deficiency. And so our job is to move that stagnation or that stuck chi, which is symbolic for essence or life or energy.
I've heard chi translated several ways, life force or energy or other such descriptors. I don't know that any of them do a very good job, but that really is at the center of this philosophy, isn't it? That the chi needs to move properly through the body.
Right. Yeah, I mean, life is constantly in this flux. You know, we're brought into the world, we're born, and then we go through growth, and there's a transformation phase, and then there's also this like kind of decline that can happen, and then death, and then to the Chinese, the process starts over again. But this process is going on constantly in 100 different ways. So it's not just you're born and you die. It's it's everything. It's how the sun comes up, and then we hit noon, and then there's this transition period, and now the sun is going down, and then the moon is coming up. I mean, they saw these changes happening constantly in every aspect, the seasons, everything.
So why I get drowsy in the afternoon?
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that Taoism as a and maybe we could talk about whether it's a philosophy or a religion or an ethical system or all three perhaps, but it dates to the 4th century BC, I believe, and is usually credited to Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, who's an ancient Chinese philosopher. So this really is quite old. And can you tell me a little bit about the book that Lao Tzu is credited to having written? I've got a copy here we might look at in a little bit. But
the book is really amazing. The first time I picked up the book, I didn't get it at all. and the more I studied and learned about Chinese medicine, the more I could digest it. And then the book really started to speak to me. And I really, it just made sense how they talk around this subject, because the idea of the Tao, which translates to the way, is this thing that you can't talk about. There's no, it's like kind of trying to pinpoint God, and the whole idea of God is that it's bigger, it's boundless. So you can't put God in a box.
Right.
Just like to them, you couldn't put the Tao in a box. It's this essence that flows through you and is all around you and is in everything else, and therefore you can't name it, you know.
Well, that's the way.
You can try to.
Well, the book is entitled Tao Te Ching, right? And I think that's the way it starts. Something like the the Tao is something you can't talk about, or the Tao you talk about is really not the real thing. So you're right in suggesting it's an elusive principle that we try to latch on to.
And I think that's a really beautiful thing about Chinese medicine in general too, in the way that when someone comes in, there's this openness. And so because there's this openness, you can have more clarity to kind of just see what really is there instead of looking for something, which would be the difference as far as like Western medicine goes. It's always trying to like narrow down and put like boundaries and definitions, and it's always getting narrower. Whereas in Chinese medicine, we're going the opposite direction, where we're trying to be as open as possible and see the relationships and how things coalesce instead, like together and work together, than how they work independently and separately, which both have a place.
Right.
So.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on today is that the region we're in Western North Carolina, does see a lot of alternative practices like massage and acupuncture, but I think oftentimes people who participate in those activities don't get to the foundational principles below them, the Taoistic principles. And one of the fundamental principles that we were talking about earlier is actually older than Lao Tzu himself, the yin-yang principle. We have an image of the yin-yang symbol here that we might look at as we talk a little bit, but this idea, which is fundamental to Chinese philosophy, which is something that Westerners recognize immediately when they see it, I think predates Lao Tzu by another 3 centuries or so. It is quite ancient.
Yeah, it first came out in the Book of Changes, 700 BC was when that was the idea, and it was represented by a line and a broken line, and it's a nice pictorial of how yang, which would be that straight line. If you could only represent this in 2 symbols, this is pretty amazing, because you would choose yang as the one line because it surrounds everything. There's no boundary to it, whereas yin has this consolidating and boundary type that happens, such as the heavens and the earth, or the body and that which is around it, the environment. And anyways, they depicted yin as these 2 broken lines.
Now the symbol we're used to seeing, I think, more often, and maybe we can get this up on the screen, is a circular image with light and dark. Here we go.
Yeah.
So this is the very familiar yin and yang that we see in jewelry and bumper stickers, but it's really a very ancient Chinese symbol that lies at the heart of what you're talking about with Taoism, and actually with the practice of Chinese medicine.
Yeah, so we actually say that yin creates yang because it is the heavier of the 2 substances, and it's falling. And so yin creates yang, and then yang, because it's this activating force, it activates yin. Therefore, there is yang within yin, and there's yin within yang. And what's actually missing about this symbol is that it's actually moving. And so really it should be depicted with like circles around it, because yin is becoming yang, and yang is also becoming yin constantly. That's how there's this transformational quality that's happening. And if that doesn't happen, things get stuck.
And I guess one thing we should clarify, and maybe with the next image we have here, is that the yin and the yang elements here actually represent certain characteristics of life that are complementary to one another, sometimes opposing to one another. But the idea depicted in this symbol, in the next image, demonstrates that they're working together toward one another. Here we have an example of this. You have yin is typically considered female and dark, and yang is male and bright, for example. But you have the idea here is a balance between opposing forces. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Or complementary forces, perhaps.
Yeah, it's opposing and what did you
complementary.
Complementary.
Yeah,
yes, it's opposing and complementary at the exact same time, and that's how it's a relationship. So it's really important when you talk about yin and yang, you talk about the opposing and complementary forces instead of just like, well, light is yang, because it's only yang in comparison to yin, and that's how we look at things in the body too. So
yeah,
does that make sense?
In the West, we tend to think more oppositionally. So we would see that symbol and we'd say, all right, this is the light part and this is the dark part, and they're separate. But that's not the idea here. They're, as you said, I think, using the idea of motion, they're moving into one another at all times so that they're part of one another. And that feeds into the ideas of Chinese medicine and how that's then applied to body work. Is that correct? Yeah, and you were mentioning, and maybe this will give some illustration of that there are, when you start to apply these principles to the body, to healing or to health, you said there's something called the 5 phases or 5 elements, and we, I do have an image here that we can look at while you talk about this, but this helps us to apply some of these principles to the body in particular. Is that right? Yeah, here we go.
So the 5 element, which is what some people call this, is actually translated more into the 5 walks or 5 movements of life. And basically you would have wood that is just symbolic. It's wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. And each of these elements is just symbolic as far as their nature goes. So like the nature of wood is to sprout and grow. And then the nature of fire is like this warmth element that has the tendency to build and produce heat. And then the earth element, when things go into the earth, they transform, they're broken down. The metal quality they actually saw the metal as producing water. So they used the element metal, the idea of metal, as actually a drying quality to it, and then water has this fluid, moisturizing, cold quality to it, and so all 5 of these phases actually work together. So, for instance, wood fuels fire, and then fire, the ashes from fire nourish earth, and then earth. Within the earth makes metal. That's where metals come from. And then metal, if you hang metal out, it collects water, and then water goes back and is nourishing wood. So this is called the generating cycle of how they all support each other. And then the control cycle is if you skip every other one. And so, for instance, wood, when wood grows, the roots go down and it moves the earth. So
there's connection there as well.
Yes, and then we could.
So this all sounds. I mean, to Westerners, it sounds very esoteric and mystical, and I guess it is, right?
It does, but it's symbolic, and that's how we end up getting back to the body.
Right.
So, for instance, when you eat food, it goes to the stomach first for this digestion of ripening and rotting the food, and that would be symbolic of the earth. That's how they connected. Just as an example, each of these 5 phases also correlates with the body.
Right, so the phases or the elements correlate to various parts of the body, so you're trying to create, I guess, that same kind of movement, same kind of balance and harmony within the body that you see in nature.
Absolutely.
And that seems to me a kind of fundamental idea in Taoism anyway, that we see in natural processes and in nature the qi force moving as it should, and when our own lives are in balance, when our bodies are in balance, that same sort of natural process kind of takes over.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So you've been practicing now for quite some time in the area as a massage therapist, and I think you incorporate some acupressure techniques.
Yeah.
And more recently, you've been training in a school of Chinese medicine, and also training for acupuncture, right?
Right.
So could you tell me maybe first about massage? So if you're working with a client and you're incorporating massage therapy as a modality for creating health or well-being, what sort of thing are you as a practitioner actually doing in that process? Or
I feel so lucky to have the job that I do. I love it, and I've been doing it for 10 years now, and so every time I touch somebody, I learn from their body, basically. And so because of the fact that I have touched so many people over the course of 10 years, I kind of have a tendency to, my hands almost know more than my mind does at this point, because they can sense things that that I won't even process. But they clue in seemingly really quickly on like problems where you have something's different compared to the rest of the picture, which is how also going to school for Chinese medicine that correlates with that whole relationship idea of how, well, this is different than that, and therefore it has my attention. And so when I practice, it's just whatever I feel is going to be the most effective for the person. So whatever it is that they're going through. Sometimes you can just see the way people walk where there is an accumulation of energy, which means an accumulation of flesh usually around that, because mass follows energy. So that's why we don't discredit it. It might sound really esoteric to think about energy as, you know, this essence that you don't know anything about, but it's actually physics. It's a change in matter is preceded by a change in energy. So when I do massage, I'm working with both of those things. I'm moving energy, and I'm also working with the mass at the same time.
Right.
So.
And so it's really, it sounds like a very intuitive process, that a skill that you have attained through practice, but also by having this foundational concepts that are expressed through the Taoist philosophy. But it's not something you go in with a preconceived notion. I'm going to treat this person given a particular protocol. It's something that evolves during the process of the treatment. Right.
I think it can be as intuitive as the practitioner is open for it to being, because the clearer that we are when we see somebody, I mean, we're taking in everything. How the person, how their affect is, how's their spirit, how they lay on the table, just everything. And so the more, the emptier your mind is, so that you can really see things, the easier it is to know what direction you need to move to give them the best treatment that you can. It's
interesting, in the middle of that conversation you mentioned physics. I don't know enough about physics to talk intelligently here, but Niels Bohr, who's one of the most important physicists of the 20th century, actually used Taoism to explain some of the physics concepts that he was working with in quantum mechanics. So that's a nice little connection. All right, so let me ask you about acupuncture. You're currently involved in certification process to be a certified acupuncturist.
That's true.
What does that bring to the table, so to speak? What does acupuncture provide over and above what you can do by using massage therapies?
I feel like it can be even more effective, because no matter what I do with my hands, when I insert a needle into a person, I've invaded the body, basically. And so at that point, as soon as, I mean, you have the whole body, what we call Wei Qi, which is called the immunity Qi. It translates to kind of immunity Qi in or immunity energy or essence in Chinese medicine. I've now invaded the body, and the body's like, what? And it's going to go right to that point. Now, the fact that, you know, this is such an ancient art and it's been perfected for so long, so many years, they know that, you know, when you insert a needle into this point, it has this effect. It tends to have this effect on the body. And so it can also be a way of kind of releasing energy from the body. And sometimes if you want to gather energy into this point, we also use moxa, which is, it looks like a rolled cigar that will, so like if the person's skin, we would like hold it and it would be, it's on fire. Oh. It sounds scary, but it's not. But it just adds heat into the channel. Right. And so you're not actually touching the person, but you can tonify the essences that way as well.
That's fascinating.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Well, now, given that what we're talking about here, all of these techniques are kind of maybe encroaching somewhat on a couple of areas. One would be religion and one would be medicine. And I see kind of potential for conflict in both directions. So let me ask you about religion first. So let's say if you have a client who is maybe a conservative Christian, and they come in for treatment, and they begin to learn that these techniques are based on ancient religious ideas and practices that aren't Christian. Does that ever cause a conflict in the mind of a client, that perhaps what they're doing is not exactly kosher or not right?
I have seen a couple patients that just seemed like they kind of perk up, depending on if you use certain words, just because their association in their past, they have this association that those words mean something different than Christianity. But right. I think Jesus is one of the best examples of a person who managed to go with what was happening on earth while simultaneously totally honoring himself and listening to the heavens or God too. And so in my mind, there is no problem. But I think it's always important in any conversation that you're having that you're always being present enough to see where maybe you're not being heard, right, in the way that you are trying to communicate.
And I guess you have to be sensitive to your client's own religious proclivities.
Absolutely. Like, we have no judgment on whatever's going on. Our job is just to do the best that we can. Right. And so how far do you ever get with anyone who's closed off to what you're doing? You don't. So we don't ever want to offend anybody, but yeah.
Well, the other potential conflict I'd like to ask you about is with I guess what we think of as contemporary Western medicine. Is the contemporary practitioner of Western medicine open to these sorts of alternative therapies as a complementary force, or is there a wall there from the medical community, or have you experienced that at all?
I think there's definitely a wall in the past. I really want to believe we're moving towards that wall is coming down, but I think at the heart of it, I think that Western medicine is a business, and they make so much money off of people being sick that prevention and maintaining, acupuncture has no side effects whatsoever. So, if you get better, then you're better until something else shows up, as opposed to Western medicine's really good at prolonging people's life. That might be a poor quality of life, but they're hooked in and attached to the system, and it's it's hard for them to get out of it sometimes. And so there's definitely a place for Western medicine, but currently the way that the system is managed and maintained, I find it to be pretty horrific, really.
Yeah. It seems like there's not a kind of cooperative spirit currently between alternative treatments and the Western medical community.
Yeah, I would really like to see them married, and maybe in the future, if this doesn't keep being so capitalistic, you might see that more, because in other countries where it's not based on capitalism, they recognize the value in prevention, and also just taking the simplest means to address the problem and finding harmony again.
Well, I have a little story here. My daughter's adopted from China, and when we were there with her as an infant, she was treated by a medical doctor from the local hospital in one of the larger cities in China. And the doctor prescribed 2 medications that I didn't know what was until I got home and had it analyzed. One was fairly typical hydrocortisone cream that we can buy in a pharmacy. And the other was what we would call an alternative treatment. It was an herbal concoction of plants and snake oil. So in China, apparently, there is a kind of marriage and cooperative spirit between modern, contemporary Western medicine and these traditional
when
treatments.
you really care about somebody getting better, you're going to want to treat them on all levels, because what harm is that going to do?
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to. Since we mentioned the Tao Te Ching, I'd like to read. Know if I can find my glasses here. A passage from this book by Lao Tzu. We can put this up on the screen too, and this might be a good place to kind of end our discussion. Plus, give people an idea of what's in this very remarkable book. So here we go. At birth, all people are soft and yielding. At death, they are hard and stiff. Live plants are tender and yielding. At death, they are brittle and dry. When hard and rigid, we consort with death. When soft and yielding, we are followers of life. Can you compliment on that just briefly as we end up here? We really are running out of time, but
sure.
How does that encapsulate this philosophy behind Chinese alternative?
I think it has to do with that openness that I was just mentioning earlier about anytime you become attached or in a box, your mind becomes rigid, you lose this flexibility that allows you to go with the way and move with the Tao and move with the heavens. And there's this an attachment that happens there that causes you to kind of dwindle and die. Basically, the life force is sucked out of it. So,
well, this has been really a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, Ozzie.
Helping us understand this a little better. So, hope to have you back sometime.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, that's Religion and Life for this week. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at watchapptv.com. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.